My CEO husband demanded I apologize to his mistress on Christmas Eve or lose my promotion. I said one word, okay, and walked out with a secret transfer to London that would cost him his entire empire. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The personnel action form sat on the mahogany desk between us like a declaration of war. My husband, Robert, the CEO of Morrison Pharmaceuticals, didn't look at me as he spoke his ultimatum. He wanted me to apologize to Victoria Ashford, his new chief innovation officer and the woman he was sleeping with, or I would lose my paycheck and my vice president promotion. I looked at the document, seeing the words salary suspension effective immediately. Robert had been my partner for 12 years, but the man sitting across from me now was a stranger executing a cold business decision. He told me to apologize to Victoria tonight at the Christmas party in front of everyone. Robert's voice was flat, the same tone he used when firing executives who had outlived their usefulness. He said this did not have to be complicated and that we could move forward if I just said I was sorry. I stared at him, my mind cataloging the betrayal with scientific precision. Victoria was 28, and I had professionally dismantled her flawed research proposal at yesterday's board meeting. Her plan would have shifted 60% of our research budget away from rare disease treatments toward cosmetic anti-aging products. It would have destroyed the mission Robert's father, Dr. James Morrison, had built over 30 years. I felt a cold clarity settling in my chest. I had already cried my tears 4 months ago when I came home early and heard her voice in our bedroom. In pharmaceutical research, when a compound shows toxicity in trials, you do not spend years trying to reformulate something fundamentally flawed. You terminate the trial and start over. My marriage was showing toxicity, and it was time to terminate. I looked at Robert and said one word, okay. He blinked, visibly surprised by my calm acceptance, as he had been prepared for negotiation or tears. He pressed for confirmation, asking if I would really apologize. I told him I would handle it and stood up. It was not a lie or an agreement, just a promise I intended to keep. I needed to explain how we got here, how a marriage that started in graduate school with so much promise ended with a weaponized corporate policy on Christmas Eve. We met when I was 26 and finishing my PhD in biochemistry. Robert was finishing his MBA, and he seemed to care about the science. He told me his father's company was bleeding money because Big Pharma wouldn't touch rare diseases, and he wanted to prove you could do well by doing good. I believed him then. We got married 8 years ago, right after he took over as CEO doctor. Morrison had stepped back to chairman and trusted me as the director of strategic planning. In 4 years, we tripled revenue and brought 2 new treatments to market, including one for pediatric leukemia. Dr. Morrison called me the smartest person in the organization. But success changed Robert. He started measuring worth by stock price instead of lives saved. He started talking about higher margin opportunities and age management treatments. I became inconvenient because I prioritized research integrity over quarterly profits. 6 months ago, things shifted. He started coming home late, smelling like perfume I did not own, and stopped touching me. I told myself it was stress, but I was lying. Then came the day 4 months ago when I stopped at the grocery store to buy ingredients for pasta carbonara to surprise him. I walked into our penthouse and heard Victoria singing his name. I saw her red Soldents by the door and 2 champagne glasses on the coffee table. I backed out quietly, went to a hotel, and cried for 3 hours before making my plan. I did not confront him. Instead, I called Dr. Morrison and volunteered for the European expansion he had mentioned. For 4 months, I worked late building relationships with researchers at Cambridge and Oxford while documenting Robert's ethical compromises. I kept track of company credit card statements, showing hotel rooms and jewelry purchases. Then came yesterday's board meeting, where Victoria presented her plan to gut our research. I dismantled it methodically. Dr. Morrison agreed with my analysis, and the board tabled her proposal. Victoria went white with rage. Now, sitting in Robert's office, the weight of the last 4 months felt heavy. In my briefcase downstairs was a folder Dr. Morrison had given me an hour ago. It contained documents restructuring my role into Managing Director of Morrison Pharmaceuticals Europe, approved by the board and filed with the SEC. Robert thought my okay meant surrender. I walked out of his office and headed down to the Christmas party, the crystal chandeliers casting a warm light over a room full of people who had no idea the company was about to change forever. I grabbed a glass of champagne and saw Jennifer Chin from Regulatory Affairs. She looked at me with concern and whispered that everyone knew about Robert and Victoria. She told me the scientists were on my side. I told her Robert wanted a public apology and had suspended my salary. Jennifer went pale, calling it an abuse of authority. I told her I had options. Then the energy in the room shifted. Victoria arrived in a red dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, moving through the room like she owned it. Victoria saw me and raised her glass in a mock toast. She thought she had won. I told Jennifer that Victoria was playing checkers, while the rest of us were playing chess. I watched Robert emerge from the elevator and scan the room. He and Victoria were inseparable now, making every decision together while pushing out anyone who questioned them. I knew the moment was coming. Robert started walking toward me with Victoria possessively on his arm. He told me we needed to talk in his office in 5 minutes. I stood my ground near the windows as Robert and Victoria approached. The string quartet was playing a classical piece that felt far too elegant for the conversation about to happen. Robert's jaw was tight, his CEO mask firmly in place. He said Victoria deserved an explanation for yesterday. I told him she got one at the board meeting when I showed why her proposal would damage the company. Victoria's smile did not waver, but her eyes went cold. She accused me of protecting an outdated business model because I saw her as a threat. I looked at her and asked if she had ever actually worked in pharmaceutical research, or if she just consulted for companies that prioritized profit over patients. Robert gave me a warning look and told me to be in his office in 5 minutes. I watched them walk away, Victoria's red dress a sharp slash of color against the crowd. Jennifer appeared at my elbow and asked if I was going up there alone. I told her I had everything I need. I felt the folder in my briefcase downstairs like a physical weight, containing the documents that would end my marriage. The elevator ride back to the executive floor was silent. I squared my shoulders and walked into Robert's office. He was sitting behind his mahogany desk in a leather chair designed to make him sit higher than everyone else. Victoria was by the window with her champagne. Robert told me to close the door and sit. I remained standing. He said we needed to resolve the situation, and that Victoria had expressed concerns about working with me. He claimed my presentation was not about data, but about making her look incompetent. I almost laughed at the audacity. I told him I saw her as a consultant with an MBA who thought buzzwords qualified her to revolutionize science. I told him her proposal would have gutted our rare disease division and driven away our researchers. Victoria's composure cracked, and she called me hostile. Robert stood up and walked around the desk to stand beside her, making it clear whose side he was on. He said undermining her was undermining his authority. I told him what was actually unacceptable was using his position to protect his mistress at the expense of his wife's career. Robert went pale and asked what I was implying. I told him I was stating facts. He had hired her without consulting me and was now using HR mechanisms to punish me. I told him his judgment was catastrophically compromised. Victoria laughed and told Robert I was accusing him of misconduct because I could not accept my approach was outdated. Robert pulled the personnel action form from his desk. He said my salary was suspended and my promotion postponed indefinitely until I issued a public apology. He claimed multiple people had documented concerns about my management style. I asked to see the documentation from the researchers. Robert said it was part of an internal investigation and I would have access through proper channels. I knew the complaints did not exist or were fabricated. He told me I had a chance to resolve this the easy way by committing to better collaboration. I asked if that meant staying quiet when I saw strategic mistakes being made. Victoria interjected that it meant treating senior leadership with respect. I looked at her and realized she wanted more than a promotion. She wanted to prove she had replaced me in every way. I turned to Robert and told him I was not apologizing. I said if Victoria was embarrassed, it was a consequence of her flawed proposal. Robert's jaw tightened, and he said if I refused, they would have to consider if my position was viable at all. He asked if I understood the consequences on Christmas Eve. I told him he was right that actions have consequences, and that he was about to learn that. I told him I was not the person who would accept humiliation to keep a job or stay in a company where the CEO protected his affair. Victoria told me I would end up with nothing if I quit. I told her I might end up with something better that did not require compromising my integrity. I headed for the door, and Robert stopped me at the threshold, saying if I walked out, there was no coming back. I looked at him and said I would handle it and give my answer at the party. I walked out, leaving them in the office. I took the elevator back down, my hands steady. I found Dr. Morrison by the windows. He had known this was coming. He asked if I was sure about London. He warned me that Robert would not handle the announcement well. I told him staying would destroy me one small humiliation at a time. He nodded with pride and confirmed my flight was Monday morning at 6 a.m. out of JFK. I had been working with the London team for 4 months in secret. They were people who valued science over politics. I thanked Dr. Morrison for giving me a way out. He said I had earned it through merit. I saw Robert and Victoria emerge from the elevator, their faces tight and uncertain. Robert started walking toward me, and I knew the time had come. The conversations around us quieted. I announced to the room that I had something to say. The music stopped, and every person at the Christmas party turned to look at me. Robert had a look of satisfaction, thinking I was about to apologize. Victoria's smile was radiant and mocking. I looked at them both and announced that I was resigning as Director of Strategic Planning, effective immediately. Then I told the room I had accepted the role of Managing Director for Morrison Pharmaceuticals Europe. The silence in the great room deepened as my words settled over the crowd. Robert's face went white, then a furious red. He stepped forward, stammering that the position did not exist and that he had not authorized anything. I kept my voice calm and professional as I told him the board had authorized it 2 weeks ago and Dr. Morrison had signed off personally. I told him it had already been filed with the SEC and that I was surprised he had not seen the paperwork, though he had been quite distracted lately. The guests exchanged glances, the subtext of my comment hitting home. Dr. Morrison stepped forward and suggested they discuss this in private, but Robert was desperate. He told me I could not leave because the projects needed someone who understood the science. I finished his sentence, saying they needed someone who cared about the mission. I told him everything was arranged and I would start in London on January 2nd. Then I turned to Victoria and gave her the coldest smile I could manage. I congratulated her on her promotion to Director of Strategic Planning. I told her I had left detailed transition notes in my office because she would need them. Victoria's face was pale. She had expected my humiliation, but instead, she was being handed a job she was not qualified for in front of the entire company. I started toward the exit with my head high. Robert called out that we needed to talk, but I just said, okay. In this context, it meant I was done. I walked out into the December night, leaving Robert shouting for his father about succession documents and equity restructuring. I had 36 hours until my flight. I drove to a hotel near JFK, my phone buzzing with 23 calls from Robert and 18 from Victoria. I ignored them all. I ordered a club sandwich I barely touched and spent Christmas Eve reviewing London documents. On Christmas morning, I called Dr. Morrison. He told me Robert had spent the night trying to find legal grounds to block my transfer, but my contract had international mobility clauses, and the board approval was ironclad. He told me Victoria had tried to demand my contact lists for Cambridge and Oxford. Dr. Morrison had told her that my professional relationships belonged to me. Robert had asked him to reconsider, claiming my independence would create conflicts. Dr. Morrison told him it was time the company had more than one strategic vision. He apologized to me for what Robert had become and said I deserved better. I spent the rest of Christmas Day preparing, studying UK employment regulations and mapping out my first 90 days. I blocked Robert's number after sending a text saying my lawyer would contact him about separation proceedings. Monday morning, I went through security with my British work visa. The flight was long, and I watched the Atlantic scroll past, separating my old life from the new one. I landed at Heathrow on Tuesday evening, exhausted. Marcus from the London team met me with a sign and a warm smile. He told me they had my apartment ready and had even stocked groceries and found a coffee maker. That small kindness made me feel more welcomed than I had in years. The Shoreditch office was modern and filled with light, a place where people actually worked. My team was small, but they were excited about the science of rare diseases. No one there knew about the affair or the Christmas Eve confrontation. I was just Dr. Linda Morrison, the new managing director. But news from New York filtered back through Jennifer. She sent emails about the latest disasters. Victoria's cosmetics pivot had been approved, and within 2 months, 3 of the best scientists had resigned in protest. Dr. Sarah Chin had left for Johns Hopkins, taking her entire team. Morale was collapsing, and the culture had become toxic. Robert kept promising the cosmetics division would fund the mission, but nobody believed him. I read these updates with sadness, watching something I helped build crumble. In late spring, Mark from Research Operations called to tell me about a Forbes profile on Robert. It praised his bold strategic vision and mentioned Victoria as his innovative Chief Strategy Officer. My departure was a single sentence about an amicable transition. The article ignored the talent hemorrhaging from the company and the erosion of academic partnerships. Mark told me Robert and Victoria were inseparable and that anyone who questioned them was pushed out. But Victoria was struggling. She tried to leverage my old contacts, but Dr. Hammond at Cambridge told her he had no interest in a company that prioritized anti-aging creams. Victoria tried to buy partnerships with inflated grants, but the top researchers declined. Then she made a critical mistake. She approved 3 cosmetic research projects that were scientifically questionable. One compound showed liver toxicity, but she pushed it forward anyway. The FDA killed the project before phase 1 trials, costing the company $8 million and massive reputational damage. Robert should have held her accountable, but he defended every decision. His ego was so entangled with her that admitting her failure meant admitting his own. By July, 7 months after I left, the stock price had dropped 15%. An industry analyst questioned if the company had lost its competitive advantage. Dr. Morrison called me in August, sounding exhausted. He said the board was getting restless and considering action against Robert. Doctor Morrison told me he wanted to believe his son would correct course, but he had a responsibility to the shareholders and patients. He said I was building in London what he always hoped the company could be. That conversation haunted me as the London summer hit. Then, in late July, my phone rang at 7 p.m. Dr. Morrison told me the board was launching an investigation into Robert's use of company funds. They were looking into inappropriate expenses and possible personal enrichment. An anonymous report had been filed with the compliance hotline. The report was detailed, containing photographs of credit card statements and jewelry purchases. My chest tightened. I told Dr. Morrison I had documented those expenses for insurance, but had never filed a report. He said he had to ask, because the board would ask him. I realized with devastating clarity that Victoria must have been the one to file the report. She was cutting ties before the ship sank, positioning herself as a whistleblower to distance herself from Robert's failures. She was angling for his position when he was forced out. Dr. Morrison called her extraordinarily calculating. I told him that was what made her a successful consultant. Robert had mistaken her ambition for connection. The investigation took 3 months. Jennifer sent me emails about the methodical demolition as external counsel reviewed transactions. They found nearly $200,000 in inappropriate expenses over 18 months. Even worse, Robert had approved consulting contracts with a firm owned by Victoria's brother and never disclosed the connection. He had used company money to funnel income to her family. I felt a grim validation. I had been right about his judgment being compromised, but being right felt hollow. Morrison Pharmaceuticals' reputation was taking hits that affected my European division. Potential partners were asking about leadership stability. In late September, the board held an executive session. Robert looked like he had aged a decade. Victoria was put on leave pending the investigation. Rumors said she was negotiating her exit package. She was going to land somewhere else with a scrubbed resume, while Robert took the fall. The board gave Robert a choice: resign quietly with basic severance or face termination for cause and legal action. He chose resignation. The press release said he was pursuing other opportunities and thanked him for his leadership. It made no mention of the $200,000 or the ethics violations. Jennifer told me Victoria was not getting his job. The board brought in Dr. Patricia Hammond, a brilliant researcher with 20 years of experience. Her appointment sent a clear message that the company was going back to the mission of rare disease research. I felt gratitude that I had gotten out when I did. I was building something real in London while New York sorted through the wreckage. Life settled into a rhythm in the second year. The European division grew to 63 people with offices in Paris and Berlin. We had 7 compounds in clinical trials and a reputation for staying true to the mission. I had made actual friends, like Emma at Imperial College and David, a patent attorney. I had built an authentic life. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, an email arrived from an unrecognized address. The subject was simple: something I need to say. I opened it and saw the first line: Linda, I've been in therapy for 6 months. It was Robert. He said his therapist suggested he write the truth. He admitted he destroyed our marriage because he was terrified of his own inadequacy. He said I was brilliant, and everyone knew it. including his father. Instead of dealing with his insecurity, he tried to diminish me and found someone who made him feel superior. He admitted he used his position to punish me for being competent. He told me Victoria had left him 6 months ago because once he lost the CEO position, he stopped being useful to her. She was at a biotech startup now, still climbing. Robert said he was not asking for forgiveness, but wanted me to know that my walking away taught him more about integrity than his time as CEO. He said I was right about the cosmetics pivot and about Victoria. He hoped I had found peace. I stared at the screen for a long time. Peace was something I had built day by day through the hard work of choosing myself. I debated responding, but finally wrote back. I thanked him for his honesty and said I hoped his therapy continued to help. I told him to take care. It was brief and true. His apology did not change the past, but it confirmed that walking away was the right choice. 6 months later, Patricia Hammond called with difficult news. Dr. Morrison had passed away peacefully in his sleep. I sat down heavily, the air feeling thin. He was the man who had seen me as more than a wife and had given me the escape route that saved my life. The memorial service for Dr. Morrison was held in a Presbyterian church in Midtown. It was packed with people whose lives he had touched, including children who were alive because of the treatments we had developed. Patricia gave a eulogy, calling him a beacon of what healthcare capitalism could be. I sat in the third row, crying, mourning the man and everything he represented. Robert sat in the front row, looking diminished. Our eyes met once, and we both nodded in acknowledgement of the man we had lost. After the service, the family lawyer, Harold Shin, handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter from Dr. Morrison, dated 3 weeks before his death. He wrote that I had saved his company by staying true to the mission and choosing to build something real instead of seeking revenge. He called me the child of his vision. Then came the paragraph that made my breath catch. He wrote that the company was mine if I wanted it. The board was prepared to offer me the CEO position, and he had left 40% of his voting shares to me. He said if London was my home, he would understand. But the position was waiting. I sat with that letter for hours in my hotel room. He had offered me everything: control, vindication, and power. The temptation to prove I could lead the whole company was real, but I realized that would be about ego and revenge. I had learned in London that the best revenge is building something so good that their failure becomes irrelevant. I flew back to London the next morning, the letter folded in my bag. Patricia called 2 days later to ask if I had read the letter. She said she would step aside if I wanted the role. I looked out my window at the Thames and told her I was going to decline. She asked why I would turn down what people work their whole careers for. I told her I was happy in London. I had a team that functioned on competence, and I made decisions based on science. Returning to New York would mean navigating the politics that destroyed my marriage and managing Robert's shadow. I told her I was done fighting for space that should have been freely given. I told Patricia she was the leader the company needed because she had no baggage and was already repairing the damage Robert had done. I recommended her for the permanent CEO position and said I wanted to keep building the European division. We could accomplish more together across the Atlantic. Patricia asked if I was sure, and I told her it was not fear, but clarity. I knew what I wanted, and that was worth more than a title. A weight lifted from my chest as I hung up. Over the next year, the European division grew to over 100 people. We became known as the Innovation Center, where scientists came to work on diseases that mattered. Our partnership with the University of Edinburgh yielded a treatment for a rare form of pediatric leukemia that affected fewer than 300 children. Most companies wouldn't touch it because the profit was zero. But we developed a compound that showed remarkable results in trials. The FDA fast-tracked it. That was vindication worth more than any title. That was revenge in its purest form. Not destroying Robert, but making his failures irrelevant. I heard that Robert had taken a consulting position at a mid-sized company, doing strategy work that was fine, but unremarkable. Victoria was at a biotech startup, her reputation tarnished by the rumors of how she got her previous job. Neither was thriving, but they were not destroyed. They were just ordinary people who had reached higher than their competence and settled into mediocrity. I was extraordinary because I was doing work that mattered. I had found peace in London. Sometimes I thought back to that Christmas Eve when Robert demanded an apology. I thought about saying okay and watching his face. It had not been surrender. It had been the moment I chose myself. Those two syllables had carried me across an ocean and through the collapse of my marriage. I had learned that walking away is often the bravest choice. I sat in my office on a rainy Tuesday, reviewing proposal that would save lives. I finally meant it completely. Everything was okay. And that was everything. The European division continued to grow, and the Edinburgh compound moved toward approval. Robert's shadow faded until it was just a lesson learned. Dr. Morrison's legacy lived on in our labs and in the children's hospitals. I lived fully on my own terms. People still asked if I regretted turning down the CEO role, but the answer was always no. Winning is not about the biggest prize. It is about choosing yourself and finding peace. By that measure, I had won completely. The transition from a silent partner in New York to the driving force of the European division required more than just scientific knowledge. It required a total reconstruction of my identity. I was no longer the wife sitting at the kitchen table, helping her husband rehearse his board presentations. I was Dr. Linda Morrison, the woman who had stared down a CEO on Christmas Eve and walked away with her dignity and a promotion. The first few months in London were a blur of cold mornings and late-night calls to legal teams. But every time I signed a new partnership agreement with a university, I felt the phantom weight of Robert's influence lifting off my shoulders. I had spent 8 years building a company for a man who tried to fire me for doing my job. Now, I was building a legacy for the patients who had been forgotten. Jennifer's emails from the New York office became a lifeline to a world I was glad to have left, though the news remained grim. In early spring, she reported that Victoria's flagship cosmetic line was facing unexpected regulatory hurdles because the basic science was as thin as the paper it was written on. Robert was reportedly doubling down, funneling more money into marketing to cover for the lack of clinical results, a move that was causing a quiet revolt among the remaining senior scientists. I sat in my office in Shoreditch, watching the rain hit the glass, and realized that Robert had finally become the very thing he once despised, a corporate suit who cared more about the optics of success than the reality of it. He was drowning in his own ambition, and Victoria was the anchor he had tied to his own neck. By the time the first anniversary of my departure arrived, the European division had secured its third major research grant from the European Medicines Agency. We were no longer the experimental branch of Morrison Pharmaceuticals. We were the stable heart of it. I received a package from Dr. Morrison containing a small antique microscope he had used in his very first lab. There was no note, just the object itself, a reminder of where we started and why the science mattered more than the stock price. I placed it on my desk, right next to the transition notes I had never actually sent to Victoria, because I knew she wouldn't understand them anyway. Then came the first major crisis for the New York branch. A whistleblower within the Regulatory Affairs Department leaked documents showing that Victoria had pressured staff to overlook minor toxicity markers in a new anti-aging compound. The news hit the industry trades on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon, the Morrison Pharmaceutical stock had its worst day in a decade. I waited for my phone to ring, knowing Robert would eventually reach out when he realized his world was collapsing. When the call finally came, I didn't answer. I simply looked at the screen, saw his name, and felt nothing but a quiet, resolute peace. The investigation into the New York office was not the swift, clean break I had hoped for. It was a slow, agonizing exposure of everything that had gone wrong since Robert took the helm. External auditors took up permanent residence on the executive floor, and the mahogany desk where Robert had once demanded my apology was now covered in subpoenas and forensic accounting reports. Jennifer told me that the office felt like a funeral parlor, with Robert spending most of his days locked behind his door, while Victoria was seen less and less, her radiant, triumphant smile replaced by the panicked look of someone who knew her exit strategy was failing. In the middle of the chaos, Dr. Morrison fell ill. It started as a routine checkup that turned into a week-long hospital stay, and for the first time, I felt the distance between London and New York like a physical ache. I called him every night, and even through his fatigue, he wanted to hear about our progress in London, the new lab in Berlin, the partnership in Paris, and the children we were finally reaching. He never spoke about Robert's legal troubles, and I never asked. It was as if we had created a private space where the only thing that existed was the work we both believed in. The legal hammer finally dropped in late autumn. The board of directors, pushed to the brink by the mounting evidence of financial misconduct and ethical breaches, voted to remove Robert as CEO for cause. Victoria was dismissed the same day, her severance package tied up in litigation because of her role in the suppressed toxicity reports. The news was public within the hour, a high-contrast headline that marked the end of an era. I was in a meeting with the Cambridge team when I saw the alert on my laptop. I didn't stop the meeting. I didn't even acknowledge the news to my colleagues. I just took a breath, adjusted my glasses, and asked Marcus to continue with the Phase 2 projections. That night, for the first time in years, I went back to the hotel where I had spent 3 hours crying after hearing Victoria's voice in my bedroom. I stood in the lobby and realized I didn't recognize the woman who had walked in there 4 months before the Christmas party. That woman had been defined by her loss. I was now defined by what I had built. I had been the toxic compound Robert tried to discard, but I had reformulated myself into something far more powerful than he ever imagined. The aftermath of Robert's resignation felt like the settling of dust after a massive demolition. Patricia Hammond took over the New York office and immediately reached out to me, her voice steady and respectful as we discussed the path forward. She wanted to know if I was ready to integrate the divisions, but I told her the European branch needed to remain independent for now to protect our ongoing trials from the New York fallout. She understood. We were two women who had spent our careers cleaning up the messes left by men who thought they were kings, and we found a natural professional rhythm that Robert and I had never possessed. The news of Dr. Morrison's passing hit me harder than the divorce ever did. When I flew back to New York for the memorial, the city felt like a ghost of my former life. Standing in that church in Midtown, I saw the faces of the researchers Robert had tried to bully and the investors he had tried to charm. Robert sat in the front row, his shoulders hunched, the $12,500 watch he had bought Victoria, now likely a bitter memory of the $200,000 he had misappropriated from the company he was supposed to lead. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no authority in his eyes, only a hollow sort of recognition. After the service, when Harold Chin handed me the envelope containing the voting shares and the offer of the CEO position, I felt a strange sense of completion. This was the secret plan the board had hinted at since that first night in London. Not just a promotion, but the keys to the kingdom. I went to the old office one last time, standing in the doorway of the room with the mahogany desk. It looked small. The view of Manhattan that I had once found so intimidating now just looked like a collection of lights and glass. I realized that I didn't want Robert's throne. I had already built my own. I turned down the CEO role, not because I couldn't do it, but because I didn't need it. I chose to stay in London, to stay with the team that knew me only as a leader and never as a victim. I left the New York office for the final time, walking past the security desk where the guard nodded to me with genuine respect. I was no longer the CEO's wife who needed a badge. I was the majority shareholder who owned the building. Final victory didn't come with a gavel or a public apology in a red dress. It came on a Tuesday morning in London when Marcus walked into my office with a digital tablet showing the final results of the Edinburgh pediatric leukemia trial. The compound had achieved a 92% success rate in the Phase 2 group. 300 children a year would now have a chance to grow up because we had refused to prioritize anti-aging creams over human lives. I looked at the data and felt a surge of emotion that Robert's stock price could never have provided. My divorce from Robert was finalized without fanfare. He received the basic severance the board had allowed, while my 40% voting shares ensured that the company would never again stray from the mission Dr. Morrison had established. Robert moved to a smaller apartment and took a consulting job that Jennifer described as unremarkable, a fitting end for a man who had sacrificed everything for the illusion of brilliance. Victoria disappeared into the biotech scene, her Stanford MBA no longer enough to mask the toxicity of her reputation. They were together in their mediocrity, while I was alone in my success. And I preferred it that way. I kept Dr. Morrison's antique microscope on my desk in Shoreditch, a permanent anchor to the science that had saved me. My team in London grew to over 100 people, a community built on the competence and integrity I had once thought was a fairy tale. We didn't play checkers or chess. We played for keeps, and we played for the people who had no one else to fight for them. As the Manhattan skyline faded into a memory and the London fog became my new reality, I realized that my one-word answer on Christmas Eve had been the most honest thing I had ever said. Okay didn't mean I was fine with the betrayal. It meant I was ready for the fight. It meant I was stepping out of the shadow and into the light. I am Linda Morrison. I am a biochemist, a leader, and a survivor. I chose myself, and that choice didn't just save my career, it saved my life. I finally meant it completely. I am okay. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.